In a small alley, there is an old but cozy two-story house. It is home to Andrew's family, Molly and their young daughter Hera and Luke, an intelligent golden retriever. Luke came to the family when Hera was only 3 years old. Since then, she has become her best friend. Every morning, Luke woke Hera up by lightly licking her cheek. After that, the two went down to the kitchen to have breakfast with their grandparents. Recently, Andrew's family noticed something strange about Luke. Every 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Luke ran out into the backyard and sat motionless in front of the old drain in the corner of the garden. He sat there, his eyes not leaving the manhole as if waiting for something. At first, the family did not pay much attention. They thought maybe Luke was just watching a mouse or a frog. But when this behavior is repeated every day, they begin to worry. "Do you think you should check the drain?" asked Mrs. Molly to her husband one evening as they sat down to drink tea. Mr. Andrew shrugged his shoulders. "I don't think there's anything to worry about. Luke probably just found some interesting animal." But Molly couldn't help but be worried. As an animal lover, she has always felt a special connection with Luke. She could feel it when she was happy, sad or worried. And this time she felt something was wrong. Hera, a mischievous and curious 8-year-old girl, also begins to notice Luke's strange behavior. One afternoon, when Luke went out into the backyard again to guard the drain, Hera sneaked after him. She hid behind the water spinach bushes, watching Luke intently. "Luke, what are you looking at?" Hera whispered. But Luke doesn't seem to hear. Her eyes were still glued to the manhole cover, her ears pouting as if she was listening to a sound that Hera couldn't hear. Suddenly, Hera heard a small noise coming from the sewer. It was so light that she thought she had misheard. But then the sound came again, this time a little clearer, sounding like a cry. Hera's heart beats faster. She wanted to run closer to hear better, but was afraid of startling Luke. So she decided to go back into the house and tell her mother what she had witnessed. "Mom!" Hera skimmed and ran into the kitchen, where Mrs. Molly was preparing dinner. "I heard a noise from the sewer." Mrs. Molly turned around, still holding the knife that was chopping water spinach. "What are you saying? What noise?" "Not sure," Hera said, a little stunned. "But it's like crying." Mrs. Molly put down the knife, wiped her hands into her apron, and sat down next to her daughter. "Hera, maybe you heard it wrong, or maybe it's just the wind blowing through the sewer." But Hera shook her head at the counter. "Oh, Mom, I'm sure I heard the crying. And Luke hears too. That's why it just sits there every day." Mrs. Molly looked at her daughter, not knowing what to say. Part of her wanted to believe Hera's words, but another thought it was just a child's rich imagination. "Okay, let me talk to you," she said finally. "We'll check that sewer together." That evening, after Hera had gone to bed, Andrew and his wife sat down at the dinner table and discussed this strange situation. "What do you think we should do?" asked Mrs. Molly, her voice full of anxiety. Andrew sighed, his hand rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I don't know. Maybe we should call the sewer company, or just open the drain cover ourselves." "But what if there's really something in there?" asked Mrs. Molly, her voice trembling. "What if Hera was right and had a real cry?" Andrew took his wife's hand, trying to reassure her. "Sister, we shouldn't be too worried. Tomorrow I'll call Mark at the sewer company. He's your old friend, and he'll be willing to help us." Mrs. Molly nodded, feeling a little relieved. But when the couple went to bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Luke's mysterious tribute and strange behavior. The next morning, Andrew called his friend Mark as promised. Mark promised to stop by in the afternoon of the same day to check on the situation. When Mark arrived, Andrew's entire family, including Luke, was gathered in the backyard. Mark brought some specialized tools and began to check around the drain. "From the outside, there's nothing out of the ordinary," Mark said after walking around the sewer a few times. "But just to be sure, I'll open the manhole cover and check the inside." As Mark began to lift the manhole cover, Luke suddenly barked and rushed toward the manhole. Hera hurriedly held it back. "Luke, calm down," she whispered in the dog's ear. Mark slowly lifted the manhole cover. his flashlight shining into the darkness below. At first, they saw nothing but darkness and some standing water. Then, "Oh my God!" Mark suddenly exclaimed, almost dropping the flashlight. "What's wrong?" Mr. Andrew approached. Mark turned to look at Andrew's family, his face pale. "You won't believe it, there's a baby down here." Everyone was shocked. Mrs. Molly suddenly felt dizzy and had to hold on to her husband's shoulder to keep her balance. Hera hugged Luke tightly, her mouth gasping in surprise. "A baby?" asked Mr. Andrew again, not believing his ears. "How is that possible?" Mark didn't answer. He bent down the drain, trying to reach for the baby. "Hey, don't be afraid, I'll take you up," he said softly. After a few tense minutes, Mark finally pulled the baby up. It was a little boy, probably about 3 or 4 years old, soaking wet and shaking. Her face was full of mud, but her big round eyes shone with fear and relief. Molly immediately ran into the house to get a towel, while Andrew called the police and an ambulance. Hera hugged Luke tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Luke, you know this baby is down there, right?" she whispered. "That's why you sit here every day." Luke barked softly as if confirming. Hera hugged it tighter, feeling immensely proud of her 4-legged friend. When the ambulance arrived, they quickly took the boy for a medical checkup. The police also arrived shortly afterwards to take testimony and start an investigation. Andrew and Mark's family sat in the living room, still stunned by what had just happened. Luke lay at Hera's feet, seemingly sensing the tense atmosphere in the room as well. "How can a child end up in a sewer like this?" asked Mrs. Molly, her voice trembling. Brother Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but luckily we found him in time. If it weren't for Luke." Everyone turned to look at the dog. Luke raised his head, his eyes as if to say, "I tried to tell you." Hera hugged Luke tightly. "Luke is a hero," she said, her voice full of pride. Mr. Andrew nodded. "That's right, son. Luke saved that baby's life." Mrs. Molly suddenly burst into tears. "Oh, I can't imagine if it was our Hera. How scared that child must have been." Mark put his hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "He's safe now, thanks to Luke and my family. You did the right thing by listening to your intuition." That moment the doorbell rang. Andrew opened the door and saw 2 police officers standing there. "Hello, we are the investigation team. We need to ask him and his family a few questions about this incident," said one of the officers. Andrew invited them into the house. Over the next hour, Andrew and Mark's family took turns recounting every detail of the discovery of the baby in the sewer. "Have you noticed anything unusual in this area recently?" asked an officer. Mrs. Molly shook her head. "No, we don't find anything strange, it's just Luke, our dog, who sits in front of the sewer every day." The police officer recorded this information, with a serious expression. "We have contacted the hospital. The boy is being actively cared for. She is malnourished and has some minor injuries, but is generally stable." "Thank you," said Mrs. Molly, breathing a sigh of relief. "But we have not yet identified the baby," the police officer continued. "We are examining reports of missing children in the area, but so far there have been no matching results." Hera still hugged Luke tightly and asked in a worried voice, "So the baby doesn't have a family?" The police officer smiled lightly at the girl. "We don't know for sure, my dear, but we'll try to find her family." When the police officers left, Mr. Andrews' family sat in the living room, in a heavy mood. The story of the child abandoned in the sewer has raised many questions and concerns. "How could anyone abandon such a child?" asked Mrs. Molly, her voice full of emotion. Mr. Andrews sighed. "Sister, sometimes life pushes people into difficult situations. We can't predict their situation." Hera sat silently, still hugging Luke tightly. She seemed to be trying to understand what was happening around her. "Parents," Hera finally said, "can we help that baby?" Andrew and Molly looked at each other and then at their daughter. "My child," said Mrs. Molly softly, "we have helped the baby. Thanks to Luke and me, the baby was saved." "But I want to do something else," Hera said, Molly's eyes long. That baby has no one. Andrew put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. I understand how you feel. We'll see what we can do to help the baby. Hera nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. In the days that followed, the story of the baby found in Molly's sewer spread throughout the neighborhood. Many neighbors stopped by Mr. Andrews' house to inquire and express their admiration for Luke. Molly regularly called the hospital to inquire about the boy's condition. According to information from the nurses, the baby is gradually recovering and starting to open up to the people around him. A week after the incident, Mr. Andrews' family received a call from the ward police. They have identified the boy. The baby's name is Silas, the police officer announced by phone. She went missing 2 weeks ago. Her parents are divorced, and it looks like she was kidnapped in a custody dispute. This news shocked the whole family. They can't imagine that someone could treat a child so cruelly, especially that child's biological parents. "So where are you going now?" asked Mrs. Molly, her voice full of worry. "Currently, the child is being cared for by child protection agencies," the police officer explained. "We are working to ensure that the baby will be placed in a safe and stable environment." After hanging up, Andrew's family sat down to discuss. They all feel responsible for Silas, even though they have only met him in special circumstances. "Can we do something?" Hera asked, her eyes full of hope. Andrew and Molly looked at each other and then at their daughter. "Son," Andrew said softly, "my parents are thinking that maybe we can apply for a temporary family for Silas." Hera's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we adopt Silas?" "Not exactly adoption, son," Molly explained. "We will take care of Silas for a while, until we find a long-term solution for him. But this will not be easy. We need to think carefully and prepare a lot of things." Hera nodded solemnly to Andrew. "I understand. I will help my parents take care of Silas." Luke was still lying at Hera's feet, barking softly as if approving of this decision, opening a new chapter in the life of Andrew's family. They begin the process of registering as temporary families and prepare to welcome Silas home. Although they knew that the road ahead would not be easy, they all felt that this was the right thing to do. Throughout this process, Luke has always been by his side as a silent protector, ready to bring love and comfort to anyone who needs it. After 2 weeks of preparation and completion of legal procedures, Mr. Andrews' family was finally allowed to welcome Silas home. They decided to arrange for Silas to share a room with Hera, after adding a small bed and some necessary supplies. The day Silas came home, the whole family was nervous. Mrs. Molly cooked a hearty meal, and Andrew and Hera decorated the house with colorful balloons. Even Luke seemed excited. It kept barking and wagging its tail when the Child Protection Agency's car stopped in front of the house. Everyone's heart beat faster as Silas stepped out of the car, clutching a small bare Luke. The boy looked smaller and weaker than they had last seen him in the hospital. Mrs. Molly approached, smiling warmly. "Hey Silas." "Hello son, we're meeting again." Silas looked up, his big eyes full of apprehension. The boy didn't say anything, just hugged Luke the bear tightly. Hera walked over, smiling brightly. "Hi Silas." "Hera, I'm very happy that you came to stay with us. Look, this is Luke. She found me." Luke approached, sniffing Silas amicably. Surprisingly, Silas seemed more relaxed with Luke. The boy slowly stretched out his hand, stroking the dog's head lightly. "Do you like dogs?" asked Mr. Andrews softly. Silas nodded slightly, still not saying anything. "That's good," Molly said. "Luke will be my best friend. Come on, let's go into the house." They led Silas into the house, introducing him to the new space. Silas silently observed everything, still keeping his distance from everyone except Luke. The dinner took place in a somewhat awkward atmosphere. Silas ate only some rice and vegetables, though Molly tried to cook the dishes she thought children would like. After the meal, when Hera led Silas up to the room, he suddenly stopped by the family photo hanging on the wall. "It's my family," Hera explained. "Now I'm also a part of this family." Silas looked at the photo intently and then suddenly spoke up. his voice so low that he could hardly hear it. "Where are your parents?" That question puzzled Hera. She didn't know how to answer. Fortunately, Andrew heard and walked forward. "Silas," he said softly, kneeling down at the boy's level. "My parents are facing some difficulties, so they can't take care of me at this time. So we will take care of our children during this time. We will be your temporary family, until everything is fine." Silas nodded, seemingly understanding somewhat. The boy didn't say anything more, just grabbed Hera's hand and let her lead her up to the room. That night, when the family had gone to bed, Molly suddenly heard a small cry coming from the children's room. She gently opened the door and found Silas sitting on the bed, hugging her pillow and sobbing. Mrs. Molly approached and sat down next to her. "Can't you sleep?" she asked softly. Silas shook his head, still crying. "You're homesick, aren't you?" guessed Mrs. Molly. Silas nodded, tears still falling. Molly gently hugged Silas in her arms. "It's okay, baby, cry if you want. I understand that you are scared and confused. But I promise you we'll get through this together." Suddenly, Luke appeared at the door. He approached the bed and rested his head on Silas's lap, as if comforting the boy. Silas slowly stopped crying and began to caress Luke. Molly smiled and said softly, "You know, sometimes life brings us difficult challenges, but it also brings great things. Just like how Luke found you. It's a miracle." Silas looked up at Molly, her eyes still red from crying but less sad. "I promised you," continued Mrs. Molly, "we will create many more miracles together. You will see, everything will be fine." Gradually, Silas fell asleep in Molly's arms, with Luke curled up beside him. She gently put Silas down on the bed, covered the boy with a blanket, and then quietly left the room. Standing outside the door, Mrs. Molly sighed. She knew the road ahead was challenging, but she also believed that with love and patience, they would be able to help Silas heal and find happiness in this new home. In the first weeks, Andrew's family gradually adapted to Silas' presence. The boy still spoke very little, but they could see the small changes every day. Hera is especially patient with Silas. She always tries to involve Silas in games and activities, even though Silas often just sits and watches. However, Hera never gave up. One morning, when Hera was painting in the yard, she noticed Silas staring at her. "Do you want to paint with me?" Hera asked, smiling. Silas hesitated for a moment and then nodded slightly. Hera hurriedly took more paper and crayons, and placed them in front of Silas. "What do you like to draw?" Hera asked. Silas was silent for a moment and then said softly, "Luke." Hera nodded excitedly. "That's a good idea. Let's draw Luke together." They sat and drew together, with Luke lying nearby as a volunteer model. This was Silas' first time participating in an activity with Hera, and although the boy still didn't say much, Hera could see a small smile on Silas' lips. Meanwhile, Andrew and Molly are also trying to find a way to connect with Silas. Andrew used to read stories to Silas every night, while Molly taught Silas to cook simple dishes. One day, while Mrs. Molly was teaching Silas to make cookies, the boy suddenly asked, "Uncle, can I call you Grandma?" Mrs. Molly felt her heart melt. "Of course, darling," she said, trying to suppress her emotions. "I'm glad you called me that." Since then, Silas began to call Andrew grandfather, and gradually opened up to his new family. However, not everything is smooth. Sometimes, Silas still has nightmares at night that make him wake up and cry. At such times, Luke is always the first to discover and wake people up. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, Silas burst into tears. This time, not only Mrs. Molly, but the whole family gathered in Silas's room. "What have you dreamed of?" asked Mr. Andrew, gently stroking Silas' hair. Silas, still sobbing, recounted his dream. "You dreamed that you were abandoned again, this time not only by your biological parents but also by Mr. Andrew's family." "Oh, Silas," said Mrs. Molly, hugging the boy tightly. "Baby, we will never abandon you. We are a family, and family is always together." Hera also climbed into bed, sitting next to Silas. "Don't be afraid," she said. I will always protect you. We're brothers, aren't we? Silas looked around, seeing faces full of love and worry. He felt a wave of warmth rising in his heart. Thank you, family, Silas said, first using the word to refer to them. That night, the whole family decided to sleep together in the living room. They pulled down the cushions and blankets, forming a cozy nest. Silas was between Andrew and Molly, with Hera by his side and Luke curled up at his feet. When the dawn dawns, it illuminates a beautiful picture of family, a family that is not by blood, but connected by love and care. The next day, Silas seemed much happier. He took the initiative to help Mrs. Molly set the breakfast table, and even laughed out loud when Luke made a joke. Grandparents, Silas said during breakfast. Can you go to school? Mr. Andrew and Mrs. Molly looked at each other, surprised but delighted at Silas's request. Of course, son, Andrew said. We'll find a good school for you. Thus, a new chapter opens in the lives of Silas and Andrew's family. They began looking for the right school for Silas, preparing school supplies and getting the boy ready for a fresh start. With each passing day, Silas became more and more attached to his new family. The boy learned to smile more, talk more, and gradually, the wounds in his soul began to heal. Throughout this process, Luke was always there, as a silent protector, a loyal friend, and a thread that held them all together. The dog not only saved Silas' life, but also helped him find a new family, a family where he was loved and accepted unconditionally. When the new school year began, Silas entered the first grade with both nervousness and anxiety. Although the boy has made great progress in integrating into his new family, facing a completely unfamiliar environment still makes Silas feel apprehensive. On the morning of the first day of school, Silas held Mrs. Molly's hand tightly, her eyes wide open at the other children playing in the schoolyard. Grandma, Silas whispered, I'm afraid. Mrs. Molly knelt down, looking Silas straight in the eye. It's okay, baby, she said. Every child feels nervous on the first day of school. But you'll find school to be a very interesting place. You will learn many new things and make many new friends. Silas nodded, trying to smile even though he was still worried. And remember, Molly continued, you're coming to pick me up this afternoon. You know you'll have a lot of interesting things to tell us. With a tight hug, Molly let Silas into the classroom. She stood and watched until the boy disappeared behind the door, her heart full of hope and worry. Silas' first day of school went quite smoothly. His teacher, Lana, was a young woman with a warm smile and a gentle voice. She helped Silas feel more comfortable in the new classroom. However, when it was time to play, Silas felt lost. While the other children ran and played, Silas stood alone in the corner of the yard, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, a boy approached Silas. Hello, Min. Do you want to play soccer? Silas hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. It was his first time playing soccer, and although he was still clumsy, Silas began to feel happier. When Andrew came to pick up Silas in the afternoon, he was surprised to see the boy smiling and talking to a new group of friends. You look happy, Andrew said as they walked home. Silas nodded, excited. Yes, I played soccer and made friends with Min. You can go to school again tomorrow, right? Andrew laughed, delighted at Silas' enthusiasm. That's right, son. Tomorrow and many more days, I will be able to go to school. That evening, during a family meal, Silas excitedly talked about his first day of school. Hera listened to me, occasionally interjecting with interesting questions. Luke lay under the table, occasionally wagging his tail as if sharing the joy with the family. However, not every day is so smooth. After a few weeks, Silas began to struggle with some schoolwork. The boy felt inferior because he was learning slower than other students. One night, while doing his homework, Silas burst into tears. I can't do it, the boy sobbed. Hera, who was studying nearby, hurriedly ran back. Silas, what's wrong? I don't understand you, Silas said through tears. Everyone else can do it, only you can't. I'm so stupid. Hera chat tray. Don't say that, Silas. I'm not stupid. It's just that I need more time. Let me help you. With Hera's patience, Silas gradually understood the lesson. When Andrew and Molly learned about it, they decided to spend more time each evening helping Silas study. Son, Andrew told Silas one evening, not everyone is born good at everything. The important thing is that you do your best, and we, your family, will always be here to help you. Words of encouragement and support from his family helped Silas gradually regain his confidence. The boy began to make progress in his studies, and although he still struggled at times, Silas learned to face challenges more courageously. One day, while playing in the backyard, Silas suddenly turned to Luke and said, "Thank you, Luke. Without you, I wouldn't have this wonderful family." Luke barked happily as if he understood what Silas was saying. The boy hugged his four-legged friend tightly, feeling extremely grateful. From the kitchen window, Mr. Andrew and Mrs. Molly watched the scene in silence, their hearts filled with love. They know that the road ahead is still challenging, but with love and patience, they will overcome it all together as a true family. As time passed, Silas became better and better integrated into his new life. The boy has made a lot of progress in his studies and made many friends in his class. However, a new challenge awaits Silas and Andrew's family. One day, Lana announces that there will be an important test the following week. This is Silas's first test, and the boy feels extremely worried. "Grandparents," Silas said at dinner, his voice trembling, "I have a test next week." Mr. Andrew smiled encouragingly. "It's okay, baby. We will review the lesson together. I'll do well." Mrs. Molly nodded. "That's right, Silas. As long as you try your best, it's okay." Hera is also excited to participate. "Don't worry, I'll help you review." Every evening throughout the week, the whole family gathered to help Silas prepare for the test. Hera patiently explained what Silas didn't understand, Mr. Andrew asked revision questions, and Mrs. Molly prepared nutritious meals so that Silas would be healthy enough to study. The day of the test has finally arrived. Silas feels nervous but also more confident thanks to careful preparation. When Ms. Lana gave the question, Silas took a deep breath and started doing the test. After school, Silas ran to the school grounds, where Andrew was waiting to pick him up. "How do you do the test?" Andrew asked, smiling. Silas nodded, his expression radiant. "I think I can do it. I can answer most of the questions." Andrew vi Silas. "Very good, son." He is very proud of his children. That evening, the family threw a small party to celebrate Silas's efforts. Mrs. Molly cooks chicken noodle soup, Silas' favorite, and Hera decorates the dining room with colorful balloons. While eating, Silas suddenly said, "Thank you to your grandparents and Hera for helping me. I love my family very much." Those words touched everyone. Molly hugged Silas tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "We love you very much, Silas," she said, full of affection. However, their fun is interrupted by an unexpected phone call. Mr. Andrew answered the phone, and after a moment of conversation he returned to the table with a serious expression. "What's wrong, brother?" asked Mrs. Molly, worried. Mr. Andrew sighed. It was a call from the Social Protection Agency. They said they had found Silas's biological parents. The room suddenly fell silent. Silas looked at Mr. Andrew, his eyes wide open with bewilderment. "Your parents?" Silas asked, trembling. Mr. Andrew nodded. "Yes, baby. They want to see you." Molly hugged Silas tightly in her arms, trying to protect him from the storm of emotions that was coming. Hera sat motionless, not knowing how to react. But I don't want to go," Silas said, tears starting to fall. "I want to stay here with my grandparents and Hera." Andrew knelt down beside Silas, taking the boy's hand. "Silas, we need to meet them. Maybe they have their reasons. But no matter what, you must remember that we will always love you, and this house will always be your home." That night, no one in the family could sleep. They were worried about the upcoming meeting and what it might bring. Silas lay on the bed, hugging Luke tightly. The loyal dog is always by his side in all circumstances. Tomorrow will be a challenging day, but they know that no matter what happens, the love in this family will never change.